Today on Guns Club, we will talk about sloped armor, one of the simplest and yet most effective inventions applied to tanks. When it appeared, it was a complete revolution. To analyze the effectiveness of sloped armor, we first need to provide some historical context. When the tank emerged in World War I, it was a complete revolution, changing the battlefields overnight. When it emerged, there was no doubt that it was here to stay. As always happens with prolonged conflicts, once a new weapon emerges, an enemy army will develop one capable of destroying it. Thus, every time a new tank came out, rival countries would create a better tank, and so on. It became a race to see who could design the best tank and the weapons capable of destroying them. After the First World War, in just a few years, tanks seemed quite vulnerable. By the mid-20s, anti-tank guns had emerged. In addition, tanks could now destroy each other with a single shot. In the 30s, to penetrate armor, typical projectiles were used that based their penetration on pure kinetic energy. When firing one of these anti-tank projectiles, the penetration power increased exponentially with speed in relation to the mass of the projectile, making the projectile faster. This would be more powerful and capable of penetrating the target tank's armor. A heat and shrapnel shock was generated inside the tank, which obviously took down the entire crew. During the 20s and 30s, the anti-tank guns were made of larger caliber and also longer, and therefore greater mass and exit speed made the anti-tank guns very, very effective. Engineers solved the vulnerability problems of the tanks simply by making the armor thicker, but making the armor thicker brought obvious mobility and weight problems. Remember that in these years, we are talking about the decade of the 30s. The armors consisted of a simple layer of some reinforced metal with additives like tungsten, so it was difficult to add more armor to the tanks without considerably increasing the weight of the same. A slow tank was a vulnerable tank even against the same enemy infantry. And of course, let's not forget the most important thing for the high command of the armies, the costs. Armors are quite expensive. More armor equals more expenses. Therefore, the engineers of the time managed to solve this with a quite simple design modification and tilt the armor at wider angles, maintaining the same thickness of the armor. This brought a myriad of advantages. In fact, this concept was invented by Da Vinci a long time ago in 1487 with his combat vehicle Da Vinci, which was nothing more than a shell moved by its own crew that had cannons on the sides, but in modern tanks it began to be used in the 20s. The inclined armor has many advantages. One of them, and the least evident for inexperienced eyes, is the increase of armor thickness without really increasing the thickness of the armor. This sounds a bit strange, but you will understand the concept. A plate of armor without tilting at 90 degrees can be easily penetrated, but if you tilt the same plate of armor, you can get more thickness of the armor, maintaining the same layer without changes. This effect becomes larger as you tilt the armor plate. In theory, if you have an armor plate and tilt it at 60 degrees, you will have doubled its thickness without having modified it in itself. Basically, with this technique, the engineers double a resistance of the tanks. This effect was only achieved if the shot was made from a frontal angle. If the tank received a shot from a higher angle, the effect of inclined armor was completely lost, but it was still quite beneficial. Another advantage, and a quite obvious one, is the deflection of the projectiles. A projectile that hits a plate of armor without tilting can only go to one place forward, transferring all the energy of the impact to the plate. However, a projectile that hits a tilted plate is deflected upwards, transferring all its energy to a wider point and in a disorganized way, losing all its energy in the impact and thus preventing the penetration of the armor. The slower the projectile, the more it will tend to be deflected by this effect. This is the origin of the famous projectile bounces that we have seen in the movies or on the battlefields if any veteran is watching me. The first tank to use inclined armor was the French Schneider CA-1, created in 1917. Generally, after World War I, it would be used mostly in armored vehicles like the Lancasters or the SDKFZ 231 vehicles. They had a body that was almost entirely angled to make them lighter and thus faster, but it wouldn't start to standardize in tanks until the 30s. There were several tanks that used the concept during this decade, but the tank that perfected this design technique was the famous Soviet T-34. Its design is based on 4 plates angled at 60 degrees on each side, finally mounting a turret that also has angled plates with rounded edges. When this tank emerged in 1940 during the height of World War II, the cannons of the German Panzer III tanks were basically useless against them, being able to penetrate the hull only at very short distances. The German 37mm anti-tank guns also had a lot of trouble stopping the 34s. At that time, the best German tank was practically the Tigerwein, which after this bad experience fighting with the T-34 tanks, for its second version, the Tiger II, they used, just like in the T-34, inclined plates to make it much more resistant. All the tank destroyers of the Jagdpanzer series were also designed with thick layers of sloped armor to resist shots of all kinds. Unfortunately for the Soviets, the Germans would end up inventing anti-tank weapons based on rocketry and high-explosive HIT projectiles, like the Panzerfaust and the Panzerschreck, making the T-34 tanks equally vulnerable. After the Second World War, the concept of sloped armor was maintained, and with the addition of composite, ceramic, and reactive armors, they formed what we know today as tank armor. We see modern tanks like those of the Soviet T-series or the German Leopard 2 series use sloped armor as the main basis to resist enemy projectiles. Today we see it in all tanks, without exception. There is no doubt that sloped armor is incredibly useful, effective, and is one of the parts to consider when designing a tank, and this concept seems like it will last forever.